So thank you everybody. Good afternoon to everybody in the room and also everybody online. So as Schengen said, we're here to kind of promote and celebrate a special issue that we've been working quite hard on for many years, probably maybe 2 or 3 years at least. The title is Boserup and Beyond, Mounting Land Pressures and Development Strategies in Africa. It's a special issue in food policy which has just come out. I just wanted to add 2 things. One, all the articles I believe are public access. They're freely downloadable. You can just go to the food policy website and access all of them. And afterwards I'm also going to disseminate some hard copies. I think we have about 40 hard copies, which might be not enough for the number of people in the room, but you're welcome to scramble for them. This is just, I don't expect you to read this, but this is 15 articles in the special issue covering quite a wide range of issues. Authors from different institutions, from MSU, from IFPRI, from other CG centers and universities, from the World Bank. And they cover really quite a broad range of issues related to land in Africa. This is a special issue. We think about a really special issue. Land issues in Africa are special because, one, only Africa will see rapid rural population growth in the next few years. Rural populations in other continents are basically going to peak in the next 10 to 20 years and then decline. In Africa, it's quite different. Rural populations will continue growing for several decades. Secondly, Africa is always assumed to be land abundant. And in fact, if you look at a map of Africa, you can kind of see why. But once you net out vast swathes of desert and also the fact that, vast forests in the Congo, a lot of the land is clustered in a few countries. So it's very diverse. And in fact, we're going to talk about 2 Africas, a land-constrained Africa and a land-abundant Africa. Third, it's had limited growth in yields or limited intensification, at least until recently. Even that is somewhat controversial. It's had, it has limited growth for modern inputs. It maybe has limited potential too. It maybe doesn't have as much irrigation potential as Asia, which is the other kind of small farm region in the world. It may have limited prospects for non-farm jobs. Certainly it hasn't yet been successful at industrialization, and that's a big difference with Asia. It has very complex and very diverse land tenure systems. 7, more recently, there's major commercial interest in African farming land, the so-called land grabs or land investment generally. And 8, land is a really fundamental factor, not just directly into production, but as we're going to show in some of these presentations, it affects many other things. And yet, surprisingly, we feel there's not enough research or policy emphasis on land issues in Africa. Tom will talk more about that. So we've got 15 articles on a broad range of issues. This includes several case studies, country case studies, designed to understand responses to land in diverse contexts. Milu will talk about that next. Several cross-country papers aimed at gauging things like land availability, trends in farm sizes, responses to constraints, and commercial farmland investments. I'm going to speak to some of this. And then several papers focused on land tenure and land governance, quite complex. We're not going to touch on those much today. Tom might touch on it a bit. And then a synthesis paper which is really focusing on the forest rather than the trees, and Tom is essentially going to present much of that as our third speaker. So the paper I'm going to talk about is called Adaptation to Land Constraints, Is Africa Different? I'm also going to draw in from another paper which seeks to gauge land potential or potential for land expansion in Africa. This is chiefly work with Tom, and Jordan Chamberlain has also led a paper on land potential. So 200 years ago, Malthus, who I'm sure you've all heard of, argued that population growth cyclically outstrips agricultural productivity. It was a very dire prognosis. But in much of the world, economic history has not actually been particularly kind to Malthus because of various, what you might call, induced innovations. So first, Malthus himself acknowledged fertility checks. Populations don't have to grow very rapidly. People can control their fertility behavior. 6, Esther Boserup, whose name appears in our special issue title, focused on induced innovations in agriculture. As land disappears, people learn to intensify agriculture to get more out of the land. That also sparked a literature on induced innovation in other contexts and so on. Second, the Green Revolution, particularly in Asia, showed that smallholders can adopt modern technologies to accelerate production and innovation on the farm. And then third, more recently, and this is something we really wanted to visit in this special issue, which wasn't focused on in the old literature on following Boserup, is migration and rural non-farm opportunities. These have become really important outlets for rural population pressures, as Schengen was alluding to. At the same time, if any continent maybe has been kind to Malthus's hypothesis, it's sub-Saharan Africa. It's probably the one continent where we still have regular food crises and even famine. So is Africa different? That's the question we ask in this paper. Our framework is very simple. I don't want to bore you with maths, but we're looking at kind of farm output per capita and decomposing that into two sources of growth. One is just more land per capita, and the second is more output from the land. Land per capita can also decompose basically into four sources, four means of responding to land pressures. The first is just get more output from your land. We can think of that as yields or value per hectare. The second is just expand your land, expand the land frontier. The third is reduce fertility rates. And the fourth is basically get out of agriculture, migrate. In this paper, we really throw the kitchen sink at the problem. We use a bunch of different techniques and data. We have updated and extended farm census data from the FAO and many IFPRI and MSU surveys. We're using geographic information systems data to look at land availability. A lot of this is satellite data. We're using FAO stat data to look at agricultural intensification and other indicators. And we're using demographic health surveys to look at fertility rates and rural non-farm employment. We're using all these things to try and understand how people respond to land constraints in Africa, and also whether it's different to other regions. So in terms of the first response, land expansion, using our census data and FAO data, we tried to gauge trends in land in Africa, but rather than pooling all Africa together, we tried to split Africa according to high density countries and low density countries. So high density would be countries we think are going to be land constrained. And rather, as we expected, what we see in the land constrained countries is that with continued rural population growth, farm sizes are shrinking quite rapidly. In the 1970s, the average farm size in this group was about 2 hectares, 1.99, and that fell to 1.23 hectares by the 2000s. And that's actually remarkably close to South Asia, which is a region we think of as much more land constrained than Africa. If you look at the second group, though, the low-density countries, what we see there is larger farms, average farm sizes of 2.6 hectares, and basically no trend over time. Those countries are maintaining their farm sizes, but not typically expanding them. And as I said, farm sizes in the densest part of Africa are about the same as South Asia and are actually smaller than East Asia, China and Southeast Asia. So that's what's happening retrospectively with farm sizes. What can we say prospectively about land expansion in Africa? We revisit an analysis of large farm issues by Deininger and Byerly. They used or commissioned research using basically GIS data, geographic information systems data, to look at yield potential. They defined unused areas as those with very low density. They separate out forest and non-forest because we obviously should want to protect the forest as much as we can. And they separate out very remote areas which may not be amenable to farm investment in the short run or medium term. So we add to this approach and focus on estimates of crop revenue thresholds. We use GIS data to try and estimate what we think a farmer could get from that land, and also more plausible yields. And so we basically come up with you can think of it like a simple profitability function. We note that we apply these estimates only to smallholder populations. The basic parameters in these assumptions could be very different for large holders. So this is what we come up with, 4 different scenarios. If you look to the top there, you'll see that threshold we apply there is farm revenue per hectare greater than $250 per hectare, and we have assumed yield gaps. If we lower these criteria, we get more land available. So you could think of the Deininger and Byerly type approach at the bottom of the graph, kind of estimating what could be done in Africa in the long run in terms of expanding land. But in the short run, with existing road infrastructure and limited technology adoption, there's actually more limited potential to expand land than most people would think, especially without significant expansion of roads. Moreover, Tom will talk about this more, but the unused land in Africa, the areas with a sizable land frontier, is really clustered in a few countries. 50% of potentially arable cropland is in the 2 Congos, Madagascar and the Central African Republic. Tightening the criteria of how we define potential land can push this up to 70% or 86%. So a lot of the land availability is really confined to a few countries. There are obvious institutional constraints to migration. Not everybody in Africa will immediately move to the Congo, certainly in the short run. And in ethnically diverse countries, even within countries, ethnically diverse countries, it can be very difficult to migrate to new regions. Also, there are sizable costs to land preparation in many contexts. That may need larger sized farms, it may need more capital investment. And in the focus group countries, the case studies which Miller will present, we also asked farmers a lot about land constraints. Have you considered moving to new areas and so on? And what they consistently mentioned were malaria, livestock diseases like tsetse fly, and also just the cost of isolation and not having access to schools and health centers and so on. So there are pretty significant constraints to expanding land in Africa. So if we can't expand land, we need to intensify, we need to get more from the land. In the framework above, this is what Boserup posited farmers will do. They'll intensify land. And also farmers, even if they're exposed to new technologies, the farmers that are most land constrained should have stronger incentives to adopt those technologies. Boserup focused very much on cropping intensity. The ag econ profession and the CGR, we very much focus on yields. But switching to high value crops is also another potentially important means of adapting to land constraints. You think about high density East Africa, where a lot of coffee is grown, tea and so on, a lot of high value crops and livestock products. Oops, there we go. So what I'm going to show you here is just some basic regressions where we're estimating the response of these outputs and inputs to land pressures as measured by population density. For every regression, we estimate a kind of broad cross-country effect, which is the top row, and then an interaction with Africa. So a significant negative coefficient on the Africa interaction suggests that Africa is not intensifying as rapidly as other regions. So in terms of agricultural output per hectare, we see a significant effect. Africa is not doing as well as other continents in response to rising land pressures. The same with cereal output. Crop intensity, no effect, so about the same. But that also is a bit disturbing because we see here there's a really large negative coefficient on fertilizers per hectare. So Africa is using surprisingly little fertilizers given its land constraints. Irrigation per hectare, a huge negative coefficient. So as we mentioned before, that Africa has really failed to expand irrigation. And it's quite disturbing, I think, that you have two regions, Asia and Africa, which have nearly all the world's small farmers, but Asia has much more irrigation and therefore can have higher cropping intensity and greater productivity. And capital per hectare as well, another broad measure, we find the same thing. So I'm not going to go through this graph. To some extent, we kind of know all these stories. Tom has done probably more work than anybody on low fertilizer use in Africa. But we need to weave them together and figure out, why, especially the high density part of Africa, is not engaging in more sustainable intensification. So a third means of responding to higher population pressure is just reduce your fertility rates. If you've only got 1 hectare, it doesn't make much sense to have 7 kids, especially if there are limited non-farm opportunities. So we were curious to know whether people do adapt their fertility behaviors in response to land pressures. Despite this being a very rational response and consistent with a large economic literature that views fertility as a choice behavior, this hadn't really been examined before in the existing literature. We asked 2 questions. Do land constraints reduce achieved fertility rates? That's how many children people actually have. And do land constraints reduce desired fertility rates? The demographic health surveys we use ask people, what's your optimum number of children? A difference between desired and achieved fertility is what demographers call the unmet need for contraception. And that suggests scope for, obviously, for policy interventions, particularly family planning interventions. So this is a graph showing rural fertility rates against rural population density. You can immediately see that the 2 curves, the non-Africa curve and the Africa curve, are basically flat. So we're not really seeing a strong fertility response to higher population density. But if you look at desired rural fertility rates, there is a negative slope in Africa. Here, a bit hard to see there. And if you look at the difference between the 2, which is unmet contraception needs, you'll see quite a significant slope in Africa. To the right of the graph, you'll see Rwanda, the highest density country in Africa. And there's a big gap between achieved fertility rates and desired fertility rates, which suggests that there's a lot of demand for family planning services in Rwanda, Malawi, Ethiopia, these countries, but they're not being met yet. When we test...
That means that
the more densely populated countries have a bigger gap between achieved and desired fertility rates, which is what we call the unmet need for contraception. I feel like you can think of this as a proxy for a demand for family planning. And when we test this in a regression framework, we find the same result. There's not much effect on actual fertility rates, but a large effect on desired fertility rates. I'll come back to the policy implications of that in a minute. The last means of responding to higher population density, if you can't pursue these other means very successfully, is non-farm diversification. You either enter the local rural non-farm economy, you migrate to cities, or you migrate overseas. So you might think, oh, higher density countries, they can tap into agglomeration economies and have, denser rural non-farm activities. You might think that people from more densely populated areas have stronger incentives to migrate, either domestically or overseas. Starting with rural non-farm employment, we use the demographic health surveys to get some estimates of the percentages of rural populations who list a non-farm sector as their primary employment. And what's interesting is that we don't really find a strong pattern. In the high-density African countries, you have some countries like Kenya and Malawi, which a lot of people report that they're engaged in a non-farm activity as their main source of employment, but very low levels in Ethiopia and, strikingly, Rwanda, which is the most land-constrained country, and Uganda as well. So there doesn't seem to be any systematic response. And when we turn to regression results, we also don't find very significant effects. In fact, we find a perverse effect, at least for women. And instead what we find is that there's other drivers of rural non-farm employment that we're familiar with from the literature. Secondary education, often significant, road density, sometimes significant, electricity, and just basic agricultural productivity. So it appears that there's no kind of automatic response of rural non-farm employment to land constraints. The dependent variable comes from DHS, yeah. Looking now, in the text we look more at internal migration. Here we're going to look at remittance earnings, which I think is quite interesting because remittances have grown by something like 2,000% in the last 20 years, and now many large countries are also dependent on remittances. So here we do some interactions. Basically what we find is that other countries, other high-density countries outside of Africa have seen rapid growth in remittances. Think of Pakistan or Bangladesh, the Philippines, but we're not seeing that in Africa. So remittance growth in Africa has been fairly modest, at least until the last few years. And Africa so far has not really tapped into international labor markets as much as it might have. This is macro data, yeah. There's caveats are all listed in the text, not here. So conclusions. Adaptation 1, land expansion. Africa has land, but it's heavily clustered in a few countries, and there are many constraints in the medium term. We think this is actually a really hot topic for future research and also policy endeavors too, how to more successfully and more sustainably expand land in Africa. Adaptation 2, agricultural intensification. Africa actually has intensified agriculture, but largely through high-value, non-perishable crops. It hasn't been very successful at intensifying cereals, to say the least, although we have seen some yield growth in the last few years. There's also much less potential for irrigation in Africa. It's debatable how much the irrigation potential is for Africa, but that's a very different scenario to the Asian scenario. This raises policy questions such as, should we shift some of our emphasis on cereals and staple foods to more emphasis on high-value crops, particularly in land-constrained regions? Adaptation 3, reducing fertility rates. As I said, this is quite a new area of research. What we see is desired reductions of fertility are not met by access to contraceptive technologies broadly defined. Looking around at different policies, different family planning policies in high-density African countries, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Rwanda are now investing quite a lot in family planning and have seen some success in recent years. Uganda has been very resistant to promoting family planning, and Kenya had some success in the 1990s, but has really been stalling in the 2000s, even with fertility rates going up in some parts. Asian experience suggests that family planning can yield very high returns, although it obviously remains controversial. This graph is, I think, always a good demonstration of what can be done. Bangladesh is probably the country that's most famous, most synonymous with successful family planning programs. There's a little natural experiment here, of course, because Bangladesh and Pakistan were once one country until the early 1970s. After they split, there was huge emphasis on family planning, largely at the behest of USAID and other donors. And you'll see that Bangladesh has actually reduced fertility rates much below Pakistan and now has 2.3 children on average compared to 3.5 in Pakistan. So it can be done, but there needs to be a lot of will. But the good news from our results, it suggests that these high-density countries do have a strong demand for family planning technologies. Finally, non-farm diversification. I think we confirmed what we suspected at the beginning, that the non-farm sector doesn't grow without engines like education, infrastructure, agriculture. It's not going to automatically grow and create vibrant jobs just because rural areas are getting more densely populated. We've seen a remarkable boom in overseas migrations and remittances, which is really quite new, and it's unexpected for many large, high-density countries. 20, 30 years ago, it was only tiny island states that were really tapping into remittances. That's very different now. Bangladesh would have been a typical country regarded as too big to benefit from overseas migration markets, but recent surveys suggest that around 20% of rural income now in Bangladesh comes from remittances, mostly overseas remittances. So a question there is, why isn't Africa earning more from remittances? That also seems a good area for future research. The policy implications, well, Tom is going to talk about this at length, just to touch upon a few things. There's much in here that we already know, but the common thread really, we see it is land constraints permeate so many other issues. It affects technology adoption, it affects migration, it affects family planning and so on, so it's a really common thread. And thinking through this framework, we can revisit discussions of technological priorities for different farming systems in Africa, for migration and rural non-farm job creation, family planning, and this suggests that land issues really need much more attention in research and in the policy discourse. Thank you.